Diep's sacrifice becomes the final turning point. As James's father faces his last days, his final wish carries the weight of regret, pride, and a lifetime of unspoken apologies. Caught between past wounds and present love, Diep steps forward, choosing compassion over resentment, forgiveness over pain. What begins as a farewell becomes a journey of healing, where letting go may be the only way for this broken family to find peace at last. Diep's sacrifice becomes the final turning point. As James's father faces his last days, his final wish carries the weight of regret, pride, and a lifetime of unspoken apologies. Caught between past wounds and present love, Diep steps forward, choosing compassion over resentment, forgiveness over pain. What begins as a farewell becomes a journey of healing, where letting go may be the only way for this broken family to find peace at last.
She listened more than she spoke. She stepped back when she wanted to lean closer. When James talked about responsibility, family duty, and his father's declining health, she nodded, even when her heart quietly resisted. In the small, ordinary moments, shared meals, unfinished conversations, glances held too long, Diep was already choosing pain so James wouldn't have to. Many of us recognize this kind of love. It looks like letting someone go early so they won't be torn apart later. It looks like strength disguised as gentleness. Diep never called herself brave, but bravery lived in her every decision. As winter approached and James's father's condition worsened, the air grew heavier, as if time itself was holding its breath. Something was coming, an ending, or perhaps a beginning. And Diep knew, even before anyone said it aloud, that her role in this story would not be easy. This was not yet forgiveness, not yet loss. It was the quiet before the storm, where sacrifice begins long before anyone notices.
The hospital corridor was quiet in a way that made every footstep feel too loud. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the faint scent of old flowers, reminding everyone there that time was fragile and unforgiving. Outside the window, the city moved on as usual, cars honking, people rushing, life continuing, while inside, James stood frozen between the past he could not change and the future he was afraid to choose. His father lay on the hospital bed, thinner than James remembered, his once commanding presence now softened by illness. Power, it seemed, could not protect a man from age or regret. When Mr. Juan opened his eyes, they no longer held the sharp authority that once controlled every room. Instead, there was something unfamiliar: hesitation. "Sit down," his father whispered. James obeyed, not out of fear, but out of habit. Diep stood near the door, her hands folded, her expression calm. She had learned long ago that some conversations were not meant for her ears, yet her heart was deeply involved. She watched as the man who had always stood between her and James finally lowered his guard. "I don't have much time," Mr. Juan said slowly. "There are things I did wrong, especially to you." The words hung in the air, fragile and incomplete. An apology, perhaps, but not fully formed. Then came the true reason he had asked James to come. "I want you to take over everything," he continued. "The company, the responsibility, the name."
James felt the weight of it press against his chest. This was the dream his father had forced on him for years, now offered as a final wish. Refusing it would feel like betrayal. Accepting it would mean surrendering the life he had begun to build with Tudep. Mr. Juan's eyes shifted toward her. For the first time, he truly looked at Tudep, not as an obstacle, but as a presence. "If you stay by his side," he said quietly, "his life will never be simple." Tudep met his gaze. In that moment, she understood what was being asked of her, even if it wasn't spoken aloud. Sometimes sacrifice doesn't come with dramatic speeches. Sometimes it comes disguised as responsibility, wrapped in silence. That evening, as they walked home, James spoke endlessly about duty, fear, expectations. Tudep listened, just as she always did. When he finally stopped, she smiled softly. "Whatever you choose," she said, "I'll understand." But inside, her heart trembled, because understanding did not mean she would not hurt. And love, she realized, was not about winning. It was about letting someone walk their path, even if it meant walking alone for a while. That night, Tudep made a decision of her own, one that would change everything, yet leave no visible mark.
Morning arrived quietly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile balance that had settled overnight. The sky was pale, neither bright nor dark, suspended in between, much like James's heart. He stood on the balcony, watching the steam rise from street vendors' carts below, listening to the ordinary rhythm of life that continued no matter how heavy one's thoughts became. Somewhere in the city, people were laughing, arguing, living, and yet inside him, everything felt paused. When James turned back into the room, Tudep was already awake. She sat by the small wooden table, folding clothes with careful, deliberate movements. Each fold felt like a quiet goodbye, though neither of them dared to name it. "You're up early," James said, trying to sound normal. She nodded. "I couldn't sleep." Silence stretched between them, not the comfortable kind they used to share, but one filled with unspoken meaning. The words from the hospital still echoed in James's mind: responsibility, legacy, last wish. He wanted to tell her everything, to ask her to wait, to promise that nothing would change. Yet deep down, he knew that something already had.
Later that day, Tudep walked through the small market alone. The vendors greeted her with familiar smiles, asking about her harvest, about Nee, about James. She answered politely, her voice steady, but her heart felt like it was slowly learning how to ache without breaking. Everyday scenes, fresh vegetables, children chasing one another, the smell of hot rice, suddenly carried a strange weight. This was the life she loved, simple and honest, and it was the life James might soon leave behind. That evening, she wrote him a letter, not because she couldn't speak, but because some truths were easier to confess on paper. She wrote about the first time she met him, about how his presence had made her believe that fate could be kind. She wrote about fear, his, hers, and the fear of becoming the reason he carried regret for the rest of his life. "I don't want to be the choice that costs you your peace," she wrote. When James returned home, the room felt different, too quiet, too empty. The letter lay on the table, folded neatly, waiting. As he read, his hands trembled. With every line, he realized what Tudep had done, not dramatically, not loudly, but with heartbreaking gentleness. She had chosen distance so he wouldn't have to choose her over his father. James rushed outside, calling her name through streets glowing with evening lights. He saw her figure at the end of the road, walking slowly, as if giving him time to stop her, or time to let her go. In that moment, he understood something cruel and beautiful. Sometimes love doesn't hold on. Sometimes love steps back, hoping that one day, silence will be forgiven, and hearts will find their way home.
Rain fell that night without warning, soft at first, then heavier, drumming against rooftops and memories alike. James stood under a streetlight, soaked, watching Tudep's silhouette disappear into the blur of rain and neon. For the first time in his life, success, power, and inheritance felt unbearably small. All he could feel was the hollow space she had left behind, an absence louder than any argument. Days passed. James returned to the world he once knew. Glass offices, silent elevators, meetings filled with polite smiles and hidden expectations. His father lay weak in the hospital, breath shallow, eyes carrying a weight of regret that words could no longer repair. When Mr. Huan finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I spent my whole life building walls," he said.
I thought they would protect you. I was wrong." James listened, not as a son seeking approval, but as a man learning that parents too can be lost. In that moment, anger loosened its grip. Forgiveness did not arrive suddenly. It crept in, fragile and uncertain, like light through a cracked door. Meanwhile, Tudep returned to her quiet routine. She woke before dawn, worked the land, cared for Nee, and smiled when she needed to. Life did not pause for heartbreak, yet every evening, when the sky turned amber, she found herself listening, hoping, to footsteps that never came. Love, she learned, does not disappear when one chooses sacrifice. It simply learns how to wait.
One afternoon, months later, James appeared at the edge of her field. No suit, no car, just him, standing there, unsure, human. Diep froze, her hands covered in soil, her heart pounding like it used to when she first fell in love. "I didn't come to ask you to choose," James said quietly. "I came because I finally did." He told her about his father's final wish, not for power, not for control, but for redemption. Mr. Juan had signed everything over, not as a bargain, but as an apology. And with his last strength, he asked James to live honestly, even if that life looked nothing like the one he had planned. Diep's eyes filled with tears, not of pain, but of release. Forgiveness, she realized, was never about forgetting the past. It was about allowing the future to breathe. As the wind moved through the trees and the earth warmed beneath their feet, they stood together again, not because fate demanded it, but because they chose it. And in that choice, quiet and unremarkable to the world, a new journey began, one shaped not by sacrifice alone, but by understanding, courage, and love that had learned how to endure.
Life rarely presents us with clear, painless choices. More often, it places us at the intersection of love and responsibility, asking us to decide who we are willing to become. Through the journey of James and Diep, we learn that the greatest battles are not fought in public, but within the human heart, where desire, fear, loyalty, and hope collide. One of the most important lessons this story teaches is that sacrifice does not always mean losing oneself. Diep chose to step back, not because she was weak, but because she understood that love sometimes requires silence rather than possession. In everyday life, we often believe that holding on tightly proves devotion. Yet true love can also be shown through restraint, the courage to let go when staying would only deepen wounds. Sacrifice, when rooted in compassion, becomes an act of quiet strength rather than defeat. James's journey reveals another powerful truth. Growing up means learning to make choices without hatred. He was torn between a father who controlled him and a woman who gave him freedom. Like many people in real life, James carried anger toward a parent who made mistakes out of fear and pride. However, maturity arrived not when he rebelled, but when he learned to see his father as a flawed human being. Forgiveness did not erase the pain, but it freed James from being imprisoned by it. This reminds us that forgiving others is often a way of rescuing ourselves. The story also reflects a reality many families face. Parents can love deeply and still cause harm. Mr. Hahn believed power and control were forms of protection. Only at the edge of loss did he realize that love cannot grow behind walls. His final wish was not about wealth or legacy, but about allowing his son to live honestly. From this, we learn that it is never too late to admit mistakes, and that apologies, even late ones, still matter. Perhaps the most touching lesson is that love is not proven by grand gestures, but by patience and endurance. Diep did not chase, demand, or blame. She lived, waited, and trusted that what was meant for her would return in its own time. In our daily lives, when relationships are tested by distance, misunderstanding, or pressure, this kind of steady faith is rare and precious. Ultimately, this story teaches us that happiness is not found in choosing power over love or love over responsibility, but in choosing truth. When we live honestly, forgive bravely, and love selflessly, we allow life to unfold with meaning. And sometimes, when we stop forcing outcomes, what we have been waiting for quietly finds its way back to us.